saints played an important role in Father Arnold's spirituality. They were for him inspiration, role model, and, what is more, a heavenly support for his mission work. In Rome, Father Arnold loved to visit the tombs of founders of congregations, especially in the time when he was working on the constitutions of his own society. We'll follow Father Arnold to the places of 4 of these founders. This is Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill. Pope Honorius III gave the church and surrounding property to Saint Dominic so that he could build a monastery here for his newly formed order of preachers. Saint Dominic was, so to say, Father Arnold's main advisor in matters concerning the rule. In the first years in the mission house, until the first constitutions were completed in 1886, the rule of the Third Order of Saint Dominic was in use in Steil. On one of his trips to Rome, Father Arnold stayed in Bologna, where Dominic is buried. He prayed at the tomb of Saint Dominic and right there started drafting his own rule. Father Arnold was a mathematician and scientist and placed great value on research and studies. And therefore, he held Dominic in high esteem, who founded an order of preachers with a scientific orientation. When Father Arnold came to visit the Dominican monastery at Santa Sabina, he was allowed to pick leaves from the orange tree that Dominic himself is said to have planted in the monastery garden. Father Arnold carefully preserved these leaves in a box with other relics collected in Rome. Santa Sabina is the best preserved early Christian basilica in Rome. The church was built on the foundation of a house from old Roman times. This house, a villa, served as a meeting room for an early Christian community. An extraordinary treasure is the richly decorated wooden entrance door from the 5th century. It has the oldest known depiction of Jesus on the cross. And who was Santa Sabina? According to a legend, Seraphia, a Christian woman from Antioch, came to Rome in the 2nd century and lived as a maidservant in the household of a noble woman named Sabina. Seraphia convinced her to become a Christian too. Sabina then made her house available as a meeting place for Christians, a house church. And under Emperor Hadrian, both women were executed as martyrs. The next founder we are going to visit in the footsteps of Father Arnold is Saint Ignatius. Ignatius of Loyola is buried in the church Il Gesù, the mother church of the Jesuits. The Jesuit college next door is the very place where Ignatius set up his first headquarters here in Rome. And here he spent the last 12 years of his life. His 3 rooms have been restored to their original state. There is an antechamber where he received his confreres and from whom he sent missionaries out into the world. And then there is his bedroom and study, where he wrote letters and worked on the rule of the order. And most importantly, there is a chapel where he prayed, celebrated Mass, and where he also died. Father Arnold came here to this place. In a letter he wrote, "Yesterday morning I said Mass in the room where Saint Ignatius wrote his rule and missioned Saint Francis Xavier." These words reveal to us what was important to Father Arnold. Firstly, Ignatius was a founder who wrote a rule, and then Ignatius sending out missionaries. Throughout his life, Father Arnold had great respect for the Jesuits. Already as a young priest, he joined the Marian congregation of the Jesuits. For several years, he worked under the guidance of a Jesuit for the apostolate of prayer. The retreat preachers he invited to Steil were mostly Jesuits. And in drawing up the SVD rule of 1889, he used the Jesuit rule extensively. He found much inspiration in the spirituality of the Jesuits, the Ignatian method of contemplation, and especially the mystery of the Incarnation, which Ignatius and also Father Arnold emphasized. Next, we pay a visit to Saint Bridget of Sweden, in the convent of the Brigittine sisters at Piazza Farnese. Bridget lived in the 14th century and was a noble lady at the Swedish royal court. After the death of her husband, she moved to Rome. At that time, Rome was in a state of complete neglect. The popes had moved their residence to Avignon in France, and Rome was completely impoverished. Bridget campaigned for the return of the Pope. She devoted much time to prayer in Rome and to pilgrimages to holy sites. She lived in this house together with her daughter Catherine. And like Bridget, also Catherine would be canonized. Together they ran a hospice for Swedish pilgrims and students. Bridget later founded a religious order for women and men, the Order of the Most Holy Redeemer. Because of her commitment to peace between the hostile rulers of her time, Bridget was elevated to the patron saint of Europe by Pope John Paul II in 1999, together with Saint Catherine of Siena and Edith Stein. When Father Arnold visited these rooms in 1881, John Baptist Jordan was living in these chambers together with his companions. On 8 December of that same year, Jordan would found his Apostolic Teaching Society, later called the Salvatorians. At that time, Father Arnold was intensely working on the rule of the order, and that might be why he wished to celebrate Mass in this room and at this tabletop, because this is the very table on which Saint Bridget wrote her rule. When she died, she asked to be laid on this tabletop, as we can see in this picture. Throughout her life, Bridget had visions. Her vision of the birth of Jesus is particularly well known. This too may have appealed to Father Arnold, as the mystery of Jesus' incarnation was so important to him. This is the church Santi Giovanni e Paolo al Celio. In one of his letters, Father Arnold writes, "This morning I went to San Giovanni e Paolo and celebrated Mass there in the Camera San Paoli a Croce, that is, where this saint lived and died. Here he had the apparition of the Savior and his Holy Mother before his death." Father Arnold visited this place on his second trip to Rome. The Basilica is one of the oldest Christian places of worship in Rome. It was built over the house of the two martyr brothers, John and Paul. So it is not about the apostles John and Paul, but two brothers who became martyrs around 363. The church is entrusted to the Passionist order and houses the tomb of its founder, Saint Paul of the Cross, who lived in the 17th century. In the Generalate of the Passionists next to the Basilica, visitors can visit the living quarters where Saint Paul of the Cross spent the last years of his life. Father Arnold was interested in the fact that the monastery of the Passionists was one of the most sought-after retreat houses in Rome, and that for several centuries. Paul of the Cross was one of the outstanding mystics of the 18th century. He called the Passion of Christ the greatest and most overwhelming work of God's love. He understood that love and suffering are inseparable and, as he says with an image, flow into each other like two inexhaustible seas. Paul discovered his vocation in founding a community that promotes the memory of Christ's suffering and death. The Passionists take this as their fourth religious vow. Paul of the Cross also conducted popular missions, where he not only preached, but also performed the Passion in a theatrical way. Paul of the Cross as founder, mystic, and missionary. That must have been the mixture that attracted Father Arnold to this saint.